talks about indigenizing Shakespeare, I'm often confronted by the need to give listeners access to a bit of the history leading up to the start of the contemporary Native theater movement. Unfortunately, I can't go through the history of each of the more than 570 federally recognized tribal nations, not to mention the state-recognized ones right now. That would take weeks. What I'll give you is a small ideological dip into some of the major cultural shifts and moments in policy helpful for general context. Each Native nation is a sovereign nation. That means they have their own rules, languages, and cultural protocols. There's no collective Native American culture. Rather, there are hundreds, each with their own distinct arts and history. When you go to a bookstore, if your town still has a bookstore, and see Shakespeare everywhere, and no Native plays, that's not an accident. It's a result of hundreds of years of policy that centers one voice while actively eliminating others. In fact, Native arts were illegal for swaths of US history. In the early 1900s, it was illegal for Native people to perform their own traditional dances, while one of the few ways for them to make a living was to perform fake versions of Native dances in white-created Wild West shows. For hundreds of years, non-Natives had control over any public artistic representation of Native peoples. It wasn't until the 1970s that Native people could legally practice their art, religions, and culture without fear. So let's look at a few major moments that show the ways in which US policy was dedicated to taking land, resources, and the ability to practice art, ceremony, and culture from Native people. The erasure of matriarchal leadership. Did you know that many Native nations had matriarchal leadership structures, but when the settlers arrived in the 1600s, they couldn't comprehend the idea that women were in charge, so they just didn't write down what the women were doing. Once the US was created, Native women were stripped of many of the rights they had had in their own nations. Indian watching. The theater has a history of being weaponized against Native people. The press made much of Pocahontas' attendance at Ben Jonson's Vision of Delight in London in 1617. Articles were written noting the reactions of Native guests at performances throughout the 1700s and 1800s, including Cherokee dignitaries at a 1752 performance of Othello in Virginia. As Miles P. Greer argues, these writings were intended to represent Native peoples as a racial type distinguished by an inability to grasp or wield the mediations of urban capitalist modernity. Redface performance. In 1829, the hit play Metamora, Last the Wampanoag, popularized Redface on Broadway. That same year, Andrew Jackson was elected president, and the next, he signed the Genocidal Indian Removal Act, commonly associated with the Trail of Tears, into law. At this devastating moment in history, the major commercial entertainment was white actors performing stereotypes of Native people in Redface, proclaiming they were the last of their race and bolstering a belief in white supremacy. Residential schools. Assimilationist missionary schools began with colonization, but in the 1870s, the government built schools to more systematically assimilate Native youth. Stealing them from their homes, their hair was cut, they were beaten for speaking their languages, their living conditions were terrible. Many children died. Made to take English names, one student at Carlisle Indian School in 1881 took the name Will Shakespeare. Outlawing Native religious practices. In 1883, the Religious Crimes Code made practicing Native dance and ceremony illegal, and would remain so for nearly a century. If this brief summary feels long, keep in mind that this is merely a fraction of the injustices and harm done to Native peoples in the United States. Termination era. Beginning in the 1950s, the U.S. sought to terminate many tribal nations, denying their sovereignty and separating Native communities from each other and their traditional lands. In 1956, the Indian Relocation Act offered Natives job training to encourage them to leave reservations and move to cities, where the incentives promised did not pan out. This separation of Native peoples from their communities and lands allowed the government to break up reservation trust lands. In 1958, the Indian Adoption Project separated thousands of Native children from their families, placing them in non-Native homes. Red Power. Resistance to these relocation, termination, and school policies led to the Red Power movement in the 1960s, alongside other civil rights movements. Native peoples wanted self-determination. In 1968, the American Indian Movement, AIM, was founded. That same year, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1969, a 19-month occupation of Alcatraz Island, led by Richard Oakes and urban Indian college students, argued that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie required that the now unused land be given back to the Native people. This drew enormous attention to the struggles of Native peoples. Shortly after, in New York City in the early 1970s, the Native American Theater Ensemble and Spider Woman Theater, a feminist Native theater company, were founded. launching the contemporary Native theater movement. Self-determination. In 1973, the standoff at Wounded Knee drew national attention to Native issues. And in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination Act gave Native nations authority to administer their own programs and services within their nations. Finally, in 1978, the Indian Religious Freedom Act restored the rights for Native people to practice their ceremonies, and the Indian Child Welfare Act means children can no longer be stolen from Native communities and adopted out. It's important to remember that the Constitution of the United States acknowledges the inherent sovereignty of all Native nations. Every decision made that strips Native nations of these rights is unconstitutional.